Well, greetings in the name of the Lord, and welcome once again to an opportunity we have to study God's Word together. Today, we're going to be looking at the 10th chapter of Mark, and we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 12. I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation. It says, Then Jesus left Capernaum and went down to the region of Judea and into the area east of the Jordan River. Once again, the crowds gathered around him, and as usual, he was teaching them. Some Pharisees came and tried to trap him with this question: Should a man be allowed to divorce his wife? And Jesus answered him with a question: What did Moses say in the law about divorce? Well, he permitted it, they replied. He said a man can give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away. Jesus responded, He wrote this commandment only as a concession to your hard hearts. But God made them male and female from the beginning of creation. This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. Later, when he was alone with his disciples in the house, they brought up the subject again, and he told them, Whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and remarries someone else, she commits adultery. And so ends the reading of the word. Now, this is an interesting, but in our world, I would say a difficult conversation, primarily because you might have heard me in the past few weeks talk about a study coming to us from the Cultural Research Center that was put out here at the end of March. And one of the things that they discovered from interviewing Christians is that about 70% of the United States still identifies as Christian. Yet of that 70%, only about 6% hold a biblical worldview, which means only about 6% of people that claim to be Christian actually agree with the Bible and what the Bible has to say about certain areas, particularly things like what we're discussing today, things about like divorce or marriage or the institution of marriage, who's marriage for, and all those other things that go along with it. And so the vast majority of people that claim to be Christian that may see this are going to wholeheartedly disagree because they simply just don't hold a biblical worldview. So we're just going to preface that with that understanding, and many of you might even be challenged and of yourself and think about how the dynamics of our world have changed. And I want you to consider that particularly and how we're going to talk about it from the point of view of actually what it says here today. So in chapter 10, we see a change from chapter 9 to chapter 10. Jesus is making his way to Jerusalem, to the triumphal entry, finally to the Passover, and ultimately the cross, his death and resurrection. But he comes back to an area that is widely considered the place where John the Baptist did the majority of his ministries. And Jesus was obviously familiar with it, having been baptized by John, and we see within Scripture he interacts with John there on several occasions, and so the people would have been understanding who Jesus was and those kinds of things. But as is custom, he comes back through the region. He begins to teach the people, and immediately we see that the Pharisees come to try to trap him. Now, it's not. It should be noted that there's a couple of reasons, perhaps one of the why they're bringing up the context of divorce in particular, and there again, with this area being the place where John the Baptist did a lot of his ministry, John himself got into trouble, particularly on his viewpoints on divorce. And we see that coming to us from the 6th chapter of Mark, verses 16 through 19. The 16th verse is a reference to Jesus that Herod is making when he hears about what Jesus is doing. Of that, Herod says this, But when Herod heard, he said, This is John whom I beheaded. He was raised from the dead. And it continues on there in verse 17. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John and bound him into prison for the sake of Herodias, his wife, his brother's, Philip's wife, rather, for he had married her. Because John had said to Herod, It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. So John himself got into trouble on the particular nature of divorce itself, because it is said that Herodias had given Philip a certificate of divorce and chose to marry Herod. And obviously John was saying this is unlawful. Herodias didn't like it. She didn't like to hear it. She wanted him dead. Herod had put him in prison for the sake of his wife, Herodias, but ultimately, because of his impetuousness, he ultimately had to kill John. But we see that, and then we also see something else, that the Herodians and the Jews were actually working in a conspiracy type way to try to get Jesus in trouble as well. And so this was something that had gotten John in trouble. So perhaps they're looking at it as an opportunity to maybe get Jesus in trouble too. So they bring up that question in the hopes to trap Jesus and get him in trouble. Should a man divorce his wife? Should he be allowed to divorce his wife? Now Jesus, as always, asks them a question that they themselves struggle to answer. And he said, well, what did Moses say about divorce? Now, immediately they go to the perspective that says, well, he permitted it. He said a man can give his wife a notice of divorce and send her away. And we see that coming to us from Deuteronomy chapter 24. In verse 1, it says, suppose a man marries a woman, but she does not please him, having discovered something wrong with her. He writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house. See, there it is. Deuteronomy chapter 24. Moses said that he can divorce her. That was the question. But that's not what Jesus is asking, because Jesus is looking for something deeper. And he even uses that as a question of, in depth as he continues on there. He asked, what is the command? Why did Moses say what he said? And does that give you permission to do it? Because ultimately, the Jewish people, particularly the Pharisees at the time, and the practice of divorce, are saying, we want to do what we want to do. And there was two rabbinical camps that kind of looked at divorce and what Moses had said about it, and both of them were pretty legalistic in the way that they approached it. But essentially, both of them were trying to split out what exactly Moses meant by that. In the one camp, you had an idea that basically was saying, only for really egregious things like adultery. That's really the only kind of reasons why we would divorce would be allowed. And there was another camp that was much more liberal in their thought process that just said, well, anything that really could embarrass the husband or something of that nature, and ultimately that turned into, I just didn't like her today, or she just, she's just not the same person I married, or whatever. Any reason that you wanted to, you could come up with and divorce your wife. But that doesn't answer the question that Jesus initially asked. What does the law say about divorce? They only bring up the exception to the law. And Jesus makes a very emphatical statement about that, about why the exception is there in and of itself. Because the ultimate question is it allowed for a man to divorce his wife? That's a little bit different than having an exception for divorce. Because Jesus is saying he only wrote this as a concession there in verse 5 because of your hardness of heart. Moses essentially isn't writing this to permit divorce. He's writing it because of weakness in you and the hardness of your hearts, that divorce is a practice that people do, even though it's not what God intended. And that's where he comes on with the second part, where you see there in verse 6. God made them male and female from the beginning. This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. Now, I like the particular language that it says here, let no one. This includes the two people involved, the two parties that are married. Neither one of them are there to split the marriage up. But this was the case for many of them because they believed they had a right to do so if something happened, and Moses gave them permission, essentially. That's how they understood it. But Jesus is saying he didn't give you permission, he gave you a concession, which is a different thing. It says, because one of the other things that's often noted in this is, there's a lot of criticism that's leveled at the Bible on a lot of things, particularly from the Old Testament point of view, being a patriarchal thing. But it actually is a benefit to the wife, so to speak, to have a certificate of divorce so that she can actually remarry in the system. If the husband simply put her out or whatnot, then, marriage was considered then, and to us today, by and large, it's a legal contract. It's a legal binding thing. And so in order to engage in another contract, you have to be able to show that you were out of the previous one. So a certificate of divorce for the woman actually gave her an opportunity to get remarried. If she didn't have it in that society, she wouldn't have been able to do so. Now, there's something else to consider in that, because understanding again that often the patriarchal system was very definitive in this category. If you look down in verse 11 and 12, we see Jesus somewhat changing that a little bit, or it's as Mark records it, because on the one hand, you see in verse 11, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery. That's the patriarchal sense that we would see, that the man has the control of it. But then in verse 12, he also gives the woman control. If a woman divorces her husband and marries someone else, she commits adultery. And so there's some argument that said that this, obviously in verse 12, was a later idea that came in, but nevertheless, it's not completely one-sided in this, that there's both parties that have the opportunity. But in that and of itself, I mean, divorce, we know that the divorce is prevalent in our world. We talk about it from the perspective of our churches. When I do counseling with people that are just getting just getting married, or considering getting married, one of the things I tell them is that, the statistics for people getting divorced the first time they get married, it's 50-50. It's a coin flip. And the problem that we see with that is that from that perspective, it doesn't seem to make much difference whether one holds the prospect of Christianity as part of their background versus people that are just purely secular. Now, I have found it quite interesting there again, if we take the statistics that I mentioned earlier, about 70% of Americans believe in Jesus, or claim to believe in Jesus, yet only 94% of that, but only 6% of that 70% actually believe or agree with Jesus on a number of things, such as divorce. And that leaves 94% of people that really don't want to hear what God has to say about it. And I've always found it fascinating that I see a lot of people that want to be married in a church, but don't want to have anything to do with the church prior to or after their marriage. They don't want God in the middle of their marriages. And then when they find themselves in trouble in their marriage, they don't go to God for their answers. Everything else is secular, but they want to be married in a church. And I think it has more to do with the nostalgia of the sanctuary and the beauty of it than it really has to do with God. And that's part and parcel to where the hearts of the people were at this time. If it's legal, I mean, that's what we always look for. We look for the legal loopholes in so many things. Well, Moses permitted it, and if Moses permitted it, then we can use whatever reason we want to give to have a divorce, and that was being used in that way. Well, maybe she burnt dinner tonight, and that was the last straw, and I just put her out. Don't want to deal with her anymore. I'll go find somebody else who can cook better. That's a terrible reason to get divorced. And that's not what God intended. God created them male and female, that a man would leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife in one flesh. They are essentially one before God. One. Now, it goes without saying that obviously from the perspective of what it's even saying here, and in the perspective of the Old Testament, that marriage is an institution between men and women. Now, that's very controversial. It seems, that's the way we've seen it for centuries, but only recently has that been a very controversial statement, that marriage is only between men and women. And the rejection that we claim to say, okay, well, I believe in Jesus, but then again, we reject what God has to say about these things. We reject what God has to say about marriage and who marriage is for and why marriage is there. And we embrace things like, we can get divorced for whatever reason. And we still do all those things. I mean, first time statistics, like I said earlier, 50%. Second time, if you've been divorced once already, your statistics start going up significantly into the 65, 70% range that you're going to get divorced a second time. If you do get divorced twice and get remarried a third time, your statistics just keep creeping up. And, it's a difficult thing, because there again, in the context of In the context of the church, there are many people that are divorced. And the point of it, the point I think that we had arrived at that is, it's difficult for us to just go back and say, okay, let's agree with God. Divorce is a bad thing. I shouldn't have divorced this person prior to, uh, you know, or any of those things. But now I'm remarried to someone else. So what do we do now? Well, I think the answer is quite simple. I don't think we should divorce that person to repair the initial relationship that we had and just and was destroyed or whatnot. But I do think it's important that we find ourselves where we are to say, okay, well, I agree with you, God, that what I did before was a mistake, that it disagreed with your definition of what marriage is about, and divorce itself was something that I chose to do outside of your will. Until we come to those places, um, that we agree with God, we're finding ourselves outside of that 6% where we hold that biblical worldview. And it's a difficult thing. There again, I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form it's easy, but we as a people love to look for the loopholes and say, well, it's just like a child, or even an animal. When you draw a boundary, they test the boundary as how close to the boundary can I get without actually going over, or not, still staying out of trouble. But we'll go right to the line, and we'll even put our toes on it, or maybe even halfway across. Well, I'm not actually across the line. And we do that with so many things, even like marriage and divorce. And we try to make it in all the ways that we want to, instead of looking at what God has made it to be. It's not easy. It's highly difficult, but Jesus puts it in that very powerful category. One of the commandments of Scripture. Now, notice there again from the first 9 verses there, he doesn't talk about adultery. He talks about divorce. But only in verses 11 and 12, he brings up adultery, which is one of the 10 commandments. You shall not commit adultery. It's that important. And yet he says whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries someone else, she commits adultery. Now, Mark doesn't suggest it as difficult as Matthew does. Matthew puts it in a little bit different context. When you look at Matthew chapter 19, it's basically the same story. Uh, Picking up there in 19 verse 4, it says, have you read the scriptures? Jesus replied, they record that from the beginning God made them male and female. And this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. And they ask again, why did Moses say that a man could say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send them away? Again, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts. But it was not what God had originally intended. And I tell you, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery unless his wife has been unfaithful. And Jesus' disciples said to him, if that's the case, it's better not to marry. They're understanding it from the perspective of this is a difficult thing. And Jesus even understands that and says in verse 11 of Matthew chapter 19, not everyone can accept this. Only those who God helps. And that's a very problematic, again, a very problematic issue from the place that we want to be in a world where we want the things that we want to do, and yet what God tells us and the boundaries that God gives us often for us are not the places that we want to go. They're not what we have in mind. They're not according to our understanding or our desires. And so we reject it. That's why 94% of the people who claim to be Christian completely reject what God has to say on things such as this, because these statements are hard. They're difficult, and they don't line up with what we want or what we think ought to be. But yet, we must ask ourselves, if we claim to be followers of Jesus Christ, do we obey what we want, or do we obey what God says? Because one will determine for us that we are genuine followers of Christ, and the other will determine for us that we are simply followers of our own wants and ideas. So the question for each of us is, which one are we? So I invite you to consider this, reread these verses, and see what the Lord is saying to you in the middle of this very difficult teaching. And I encourage you, no matter where you find yourself, that you would bring glory and honor to God by bringing your will under the authority of His.